I'm JoBeth McDaniel, and I'm moderating this panel, The Future is Electric. Yay! And as someone said last night, we know what the future is. We know it's going to be electrification. It may include some other things, but we're going to talk about the details of this, of moving away from fossil fuels. I've got a great panel here. To my left is Keishaa Austin. She's the head of engagement and partnerships at Rewiring America, which is an amazing, if you go on their website, they've got all this stuff about electrifying our homes, our businesses, our governments. She came to Rewiring America from the energy division at the California Public Utilities Commission, where she served as the senior public utilities regulatory analyst in grid planning and reliability. So she's got her credentials, and she's also a lawyer, and from Los Angeles originally. Yay! And her mom is out there looking for the parking deck right now, so sorry for our delay. But to her left is Maya Golden-Krasner. She's the deputy director and senior attorney of the Climate Law Institute at the Center for Biological Diversity. Again, amazing website. Get on their newsletter. They'll send you all sorts of cool stuff. And that's based here in Los Angeles. She's also with Jean Sue. She's the co-author of The Climate President's Emergency Powers, which again is a really fascinating look at what the president could be doing right now to help. And a lot of, one reason Maya's here is I read some of her writings about what we could be doing right now. The wonderful writer. And another writer as well and scientist, David Reichmuth, is a senior engineer in the Clean Transportation Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. His work focuses on analyzing new vehicle technologies and advocating for policies that support the increased electrification of transportation. So, and David is a PhD in chemical engineering. And again, he's written some wonderful pieces about electric vehicles, electrification. So I'm really happy to have them all here. And they will be presenting a program, and then we'll have questions after that. So Maya, do you want to start?
Things are moving around on my on my screen. So I guess while this is moving around, thanks for having me here. Wait, that's the, okay, great. I'm excited to be here to talk to you about how to accomplish a transition to clean, renewable energy with the scale and speed necessary to limit warming to 1.5 degrees in a way that's fair to everybody. So that's the really simple question that I think we're trying to answer here today. As I heard from the last panel, climate science is clear that what we need to be doing, ending our emissions of greenhouse gases. The issue is political will. So I'm going to talk about just a few of the many steps that state and federal governments can be taking to quickly transform our system to an electric one. First, we have to talk about ending extraction and permits for new fossil fuel infrastructure. Second, I'm going to talk about, really quickly, a more rapid switch to electric transportation, but mostly I'm going to punt that to David. And then third, I'm going to talk about the use of the Defense Production Act by the federal government. So, to enact a transition of our energy system, we can't just focus on demand. We also have to focus on production. Climate science tells us that there's no room in the global carbon budget for any new fossil fuel development of any kind anywhere in the world right now. A recent Tyndall Center study, for example, concluded that an equitable phase-out requires the U.S. to end all oil and gas production by 2031 to preserve a 67% chance of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Meanwhile, oil companies are stalling. They're finding new markets in petrochemicals. They're arguing that they need to keep drilling as long as we're still consuming. And they argue that if we end extraction here, we're just going to import more from other countries with worse human rights and environmental records. However, renewables are much cheaper, especially now. Numerous analyses show that for every barrel of oil and every unit of gas that we leave undeveloped, it actually decreases the amount of oil and gas that we consume globally, with the associated decrease in greenhouse gas pollution. So how do we do it? We know we need to do this. How do we end our extraction? On a federal level, I'll give two examples. And these are in Climate President, which is a guide that we put out to actions that the president can take to combat the climate crisis without Congress. And now that Build Back Better is basically on its last legs or failed, we are really urging the president now to move forward, and we think that he's not moving fast enough. So the first is phasing down drilling on public lands. Over the last decade, about a quarter of US fossil fuel emissions have come from leasing mineral rights on federal land and in waters. President Biden has made some on and off attempts to halt lease sales, though he's handed out permits at an incredible rate on existing leases. The Center for Biological Diversity, I'll just call us the Center, recently filed a petition with the Department of the Interior arguing that federal law allows the agency to undertake a managed decline of oil and gas on public lands and in waters. So the Mineral Leasing Act and the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act and the leases themselves actually give the Secretary of the Interior authority to set the quantity and rate of production. These laws also require that the Secretary consider the public good when setting the rates of production. And we know that the oil and gas industry can alter their rates of production as they do whenever they want to maximize their profits. So for example, when oil and gas demand collapsed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing, but at the beginning of the pandemic, the fossil fuel industry slashed production by 9.7 million barrels per day, the largest decrease in production in history. So the industry can be required to ratchet down its production to protect our climate for the public good and survival of the planet. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is ending new approvals for fossil fuel infrastructure. So as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said upon the release of the latest IPCC report, climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals. But the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuels infrastructure is economic and moral madness. So when I talk about fossil fuel infrastructure, what I'm talking about are pipelines, import and export terminals, petrochemical plants, storage facilities, refineries, things like that. So again, in Climate President, we suggested that President Biden could direct all agencies to deny permits for new fossil fuel projects on the basis that climate science, as demonstrated through environmental review under NEPA, shows that all of these projects are incompatible with limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. In addition to NEPA, under the Clean Water Act, the Army Corps of Engineers issues various Clean Water Act permits, and there are provisions in there under which they can deny permits. So for instance, if a project is going to have minimal impacts, it can fall under an existing nationwide permit. Nationwide Permit 12 is for oil and gas pipelines, and we want the president to withdraw Nationwide Permit 12 as it's nonsensical that oil and gas pipelines will have minimal impacts. Clean Water Act Section 404 gives the Army Corps of Engineers the authority to deny permits if they're contrary to public interest. And we submitted a petition again to the Army Corps of Engineers calling on it to deny new fossil fuel infrastructure permits on the basis that all fossil fuel projects are contrary to public interest because they contribute to climate change and cause harm to indigenous environmental justice communities. We're working on a similar petition to MARAD to deny permits for new deep water port structures for the import and export of oil and gas. The Deepwater Port Act has a similar national interest provision. Third, in California, I'll just talk about California briefly. California has some of the most climate-damaging oil on Earth. Some of it is worse than Canadian tar sands. The state is making some efforts to move forward. They're looking at enacting a 3,200-foot buffer between oil and gas drilling and homes and schools, but only for new wells. Some jurisdictions, like the County of LA or the City of LA, are slowly moving toward phasing out drilling, but I emphasize slowly. These processes are not moving fast enough, and they're not ambitious enough. The draft scoping plan that our speaker earlier this morning talked about, the statewide scoping plan to achieve our climate goals, places the production end date at 2045, but this date falls far short of what's needed to stay within the carbon budget. We're part of a statewide network called Last Chance Alliance, which is of environmental groups, environmental justice groups, and others who are calling on the state to enact a managed decline of drilling faster, starting immediately with ending approvals of new wells and phasing out the nearly 15,000 wells within 3,200 feet of homes and schools. So the next issue I'll talk briefly about is electrification of vehicles. So we also know that phasing out fossil fuel powered vehicles is crucial to keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. We need to electrify passenger vehicles, public transit, and expand public transit. We need to electrify freight transport on a much faster timeline than is currently proposed in the draft scoping plan and proposed regulations. So I'll talk mostly about cars and trucks briefly because that's what I know more about, but then I'll mostly punt to David, as I said. So in brief, what are some of the roadblocks to electrifying vehicles? One of them is the automakers themselves. They have a history of breaking promises. So under Obama, they agreed that they would not sue on Obama's regulations, his greenhouse gas emissions vehicle regulations, if Obama did the 4.7% or 5%-ish that he agreed to. As soon as Trump came into office, they went to Trump and immediately lobbied to have those rolled back, as he did. Despite a promise to ramp up EVs, GM has sold a total in the first quarter of this year of 500 EVs total. And we know that behind the scenes, even if, say, they promise that they're not going to sue on the new standards, they're lobbying for more loopholes effectively to weaken the regulations. And so we think if they're serious about electrifying like they say they are in the press, they should stop fighting us and they should support strong EV standards. Another roadblock is truckification, what we call truckification. So in model year 2020, 44% of the fleet were cars and 56% were trucks. This is the highest percentage of trucks on record. The disparity is forecasted to continue. Auto companies spend $14 billion per year on ads and marketing, mostly for SUVs and pickups, as that's where they make most of their profit. So the short-term effects of this are that if you make an EV, and I think David's going to talk a little bit more about this, but if you make an EV, you get some credits, and then you can use those credits to go make and market more gas guzzlers, contributing to more climate change in the near term. The long-term effects over time are that as large, inefficient EV trucks replace gas cars, and we aren't keeping up with decarbonizing the grid, the gas power plants have to crank out more electrification to cover inefficient EV trucks than they would for efficient EV cars. So in California and on the federal government, we've been pushing for much stronger rules. Especially first in California, we believe that California needs to be a very strong rule because it's going to set the ceiling for what the federal government does. So up there on the right is an example of an ad that we took out in the LA Times calling on California to make stronger rules. So CARB has proposed in what's called ACC2, a zero emission vehicle requirement that starts with 35% sales of car sales in 2026 have to be zero emission, 68% in 2030, and then ends with 100% by 2035. we think that this needs to move faster and have more ambition. We'd like the 2030 target in particular to be well above 68%, because the rules should be front-loaded to secure maximum carbon reductions earlier. Because if there's fewer cars made and sold during the earlier years, there'll be fewer emissions from these vehicles over their lifetimes. In addition, the rule ignores combustion vehicles that are going to continue to be sold in the meantime up through 2035. And we want CARB to begin a rulemaking immediately after ACC2 that would require automakers to reduce their GHG emissions by 7% a year. Under the Obama rules, it was about a 4.7% annual reduction. The deal that California made under Trump with the automakers was about 3.7% reduction. And at this point, even simply reverting to Obama is inadequate because we've already lost a bunch of time under Trump. So we need to be, and we know now that we need to be moving faster. And we believe the technology exists to do this, as automakers are including it in vehicles in overseas markets. We'd also like to see CARB address the company's move to trucks. Federal and state emissions standards allow light trucks to comply with less stringent standards than sedans, and so we'd like to see that distinction go away. On the federal level, EPA just adopted GHG emission standards for 2023 to 2026. They're basically weaker than what the automakers agreed to under Obama until towards the end of that timeline. Here's on the left was an ad that we took out in the New York Times calling on the federal government to create stronger standards. Regardless, they adopted the standards, which actually were stronger than they had originally proposed, so that's great. Maybe our ad had an impact. In Texas versus EPA, 15 red states have sued EPA to weaken the standards. Actually, the Automaker Alliance is on the side of the nonprofits in the states that are defending the standards and the EPA. In Ohio versus EPA, 17 red states are challenging EPA's reinstatement of California's waiver to set stronger standards under the Clean Air Act, and we are part of a group defending California's waiver. Now EPA is working on 2027 and on with no clear end date yet, and we are going to continue to push them to be as aggressive as possible. And just one quick side note on transportation. We are also starting at the center to look into various shipping and aviation fuels. In particular with aviation, the state is pushing what are called sustainable aviation fuels, or SAFs. And we have a report on SAFs that's actually coming out in a few months. And spoiler alert, most of the types of fuels that are considered sustainable aviation fuels are not in fact sustainable. So keep your eyes out for that report because we will want press on it. Last, I'm going to talk about the Defense Production Act. So this would be a federal action that President Biden needs to take, and this is in our climate emergencies president plan that JoBeth mentioned at the beginning. So what is the DPA? It's a wartime statute. It was created during the Korean War, when it was created during the Korean War, and it permits the president to marshal domestic industries and manufacture and deploy critical materials needed for the national defense. So Biden has already invoked the DPA for peaceful means, so to create vaccines and medicines for COVID-19 and to shore up supplies of baby formula most recently. The climate emergency and the Russian war of aggression show us that the real energy security requires renewable clean technologies that are not subject to global volatility of oil and gas prices. In other words, it means closing the fossil fuel era and electrifying with renewables right now. So we put out this climate emergency president plan as a corollary to climate president. There's all these plans, and it has a section on the DPA. So we think that President Biden can use the DPA as a means of securing national defense with renewable energy technologies, including distributed solar storage and microgrids, energy efficiency technologies like heat pumps and insulation, and clean transportation technologies like electric vehicles, including public transportation and freight transport, and especially including deployment and manufacturing of charging infrastructure. So the Defense Production Act has 3 major powers the president can use. The first is that he can basically coordinate a nationwide domestic industry to create a plan to come up with how to electrify America, basically. It allows the president to establish voluntary agreements and protect private industry from antitrust claims in creating these plans, and to identify the critical goods that we need to electrify. So how are we going to get those semiconductors? How are we going to get those chargers out there? Second, the president can require private companies to prioritize government contracts and allocate materials to promote the national defense. And third, the president can offer financial incentives, such as loan guarantees, direct loans, direct purchases, and subsidies to create and expand domestic industrial manufacturing capabilities. There's an existing DPA fund that has almost $1 billion in it. And we think that this can be coupled with at least with $650 billion worth of direct federal procurement of energy and vehicles. So they already lost an opportunity a little bit to do this when the Postal Service, they just executed a contract for hundreds of thousands of vehicles, of which a tiny fraction of them are electric. We sued. It sounds like they may do a new environmental study on maybe having more electric vehicles, but they should be purchasing 100% electric trucks for the USPS. But if you combine the existing, just a third of the existing DPA funds with the $650 billion annually in federal procurement, it would be enough to install the equivalent of 464 gigawatts of solar panel for commercial and government buildings, or the equivalent of buying 271 gigawatts of residential solar, which would power around 50 million housing units, or 35% of the total US housing stock. The electric vehicle industry estimates that an investment of $87 billion in charging infrastructure over the next 10 years is what is needed to get us on the path to 100% EVs sales by 2030. So an investment of a fraction of the federal procurement budget, coupled with the DPA fund in charging infrastructure over the next 10 years, could correspond to 500,000 additional public and workspace charging ports and 30 million additional home, including multi-unit charging ports by 2030. And we'd also like to see the federal government put charging on all of their federal facilities and have it be public charging so that people who can't charge in their homes will have a place to be able to charge. So that's the DPA, and we think that that's a really huge opportunity for the Biden administration, and have been talking to their climate, to Gina McCarthy's office about that. Hopefully it moves forward. So that's the website of Climate President, so you can read more about the actions that President Biden can take without Congress to combat the climate crisis. And ultimately, ending extraction and electrifying transportation and utilizing the DPA are only some of the tools that we can use to push rapid electrification with renewable energy, and there's so much more. So I encourage you to look there, and I look forward to an electrified future. Thanks.
You can introduce yourself, I think.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And as as Maya mentioned, I'm going to be talking. Sorry, is this on? Okay. I'm going to be talking about cars and trucks, mostly looking at the electrification of those. And so, my name is David Reichmuth. I'm with the Union of Concerned Scientists. The Union of Concerned Scientists works to bring science to bear to ensure a healthier planet and safer world. I just want to, is there a way to hide the Zoom so I don't see myself? Thank you. It's very distracting. I work in our Oakland, California office. I specialize on the analysis of clean transportation options, and I also work to get those clean transportation options out there through the use of policy. This session is called The Future is Electric, and so I think the first question is, well, why does the future need to be electric for cars and trucks? The simple answer is in California, passenger vehicles, so our cars and trucks that many of us drive, are responsible for over 1/4 of human-caused global warming emissions. So it's the largest sector that we need to address. Now, we need to address all of those sectors, but we certainly need to address transportation, in particular passenger cars and trucks. In addition, the cars and trucks we drive are responsible for a significant portion of smog-forming air pollution, emissions, especially in the Central Valley and in Southern California. Now, I think Larry in the last section mentioned that the air is cleaner than it was 30 years ago. It's still the worst in the nation. So we still have a lot of work to do there. A fully electric vehicle with no tailpipe emissions seems like it would be a better alternative. However, we want to be able to quantify the benefits, especially on the global warming benefits. So we know that while there's no tailpipe emissions from an electric vehicle, we're getting that electricity from somewhere. And even in California, it's not all from renewable sources, not all from zero carbon sources. So we did a life cycle analysis to try to compare the gasoline vehicle and an electric vehicle. So for a gasoline vehicle, that means adding up all of the emissions from getting crude oil out of the ground, getting it to a refinery, turning it into gasoline, getting that gasoline to a filling station, and then, of course, burning it in the gasoline vehicle. For an electric vehicle, that means, well, what are the emissions from getting coal or natural gas out of the ground, getting it to a power plant, the emissions from that power plant, and taking into account all the losses in the system, getting that electricity to the electric vehicle. And so we did that on a nationwide basis, and what we found was that that the emissions vary, and we put it in terms of what the average electric vehicle, what a gasoline car would have to achieve to get the same emissions as an electric vehicle. So in California, driving the average electric vehicle produces emissions equal to what a hypothetical 134 mile per gallon gasoline vehicle would produce. Now that's for the average vehicle. For the most efficient vehicle, Tesla Model 3, it would be equal to driving a 177 mile per gallon gasoline vehicle. Now that's based on the most recent data from the EPA, which goes back a couple years. The important part about EVs is that while today we're going to get less than 1/4 of the emissions from an EV than you would get from a new gasoline car, in California we know we're going to make the grid cleaner. And that means that over time these numbers should get better. And the nice thing about electric cars is that while new electric cars will be effectively cleaner, also all those existing electric cars on the road, as we clean up the grid, will also be effectively cleaner. Now, I do want to emphasize that EVs are not perfect in terms of global warming emissions. There still are emissions from driving an electric vehicle. And they're just much better than a gasoline vehicle. So avoiding driving a vehicle, avoiding driving an EV by biking or walking or using public transit is going to be much lower or zero emissions. And so we need to do that in every place that we can do that. But we know that with the way our cities are built and the way our economy is built, that we can't eliminate passenger cars right now today. And so that when we do need to drive, when we do need to use vehicles, that we need to convert those from gasoline to electricity. So it's not a either or. It's a definitely do as much on these on all of these as we can at this time. Now, the title of this session was the future is electric. And so if you talk about cars, the future of cars is electric. When I started at Union of Concerned Scientists about 10 years ago, that maybe had a question mark at the end of it, that the future of cars is electric, maybe. If you looked at what was available in 2012, the EV sales, there were not that many models available, pretty low numbers. A lot of these vehicles were not very good in terms of the sort of the car companies were making these to comply with regulations and trying to get you to buy them despite the fact they were electric. And I would go to meetings in Sacramento at the Air Resources Board, and the automakers would stand up and say, look, you can force us to make a few of these, but nobody wants to buy them, so this isn't going to work. If you fast forward to today, the number of models available and the volumes are much higher. You probably can't read all of these on here, and I cropped some of them, but most of the manufacturers now make cars and electric vehicles, and the volumes are much higher. So right now, I don't think there's not as much question about whether the future is electric. And we also have a lot of statements from automakers in terms of GM last year saying that by 2035 they want to be all zero-emission vehicles. Volkswagen making a lot of promises. Mercedes prepares to go all electric. Here's their press release. Volvo, has been saying that they're going to make 50% of their cars by 2025 to be fully electric. These are all great. I mean, this is a great sign. However, it's important that these are press releases. This is them signaling maybe an intention. Maybe it's signaling that they see the valuation, how Wall Street values Tesla, and they would like to be valued on that basis and not as maybe as a manufacturing company. What's going on behind the scenes is while they all, while many of them say that they want to go all electric, there are a lot of forces. Some of the automakers, definitely a lot of the fossil fuel companies, would like to make that transition as long as possible. Even if they agree that the future is electric, maybe we shouldn't go that fast. Maybe we should make this a 30-year transition, a 40-year transition. And it is a plan to delay, to keep the profits from making large gasoline vehicles and delay this transition. So I think the question no longer is, are electric vehicles, are electric cars and trucks the future? It's sort of how quickly can we get to that future? That is really the question before us, especially in California. And so what can we do? Probably one of the most important things that's happening right now that Maya already mentioned is the regulator for vehicle emissions in California, the California Air Resources Board, is in the process right now. There's going to be a meeting next Thursday on looking at zero-emission vehicle sales requirements. And this is what's been proposed. Starting at 35% for model year 2026 vehicles, going to 100% by 2035. I'm really interested, actually in the middle of that curve, 2030 being at 68%. I'd like that to be higher, because while we do need to get to 100%, the key for me is, when do we get this transition for the auto companies when the majority of their vehicles are electric, when they really have to make that transition in their marketing department, in their manufacturing, in their dealerships, to selling more EVs than gasoline vehicles. because I think that will really drive it. I'm less worried about that last 5% about in terms of when do we get to that transition point to where they make a business decision that we are an electric company first, electric vehicle company first. But I just want to point out this requirement is a big deal, and this will be up for a final vote in the first part of August. And we're going to see a lot of pushback on this, maybe not directly from the automakers. The automakers will ask for flexibility, so loopholes. That's to be expected. We're going to see a lot of questions come out from sort of unknown places about just asking questions. Can we really do this? Is it going to cost too much, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's really important to have this framing that that zero emission vehicles are a better alternative. They are going to be cheaper for our society, and this is where we need to go. And oftentimes those questions about zero emission vehicles ignore the current incumbent technology. So ignore we ask questions about how these vehicles are made or what's the emissions from using the electric vehicles, ignoring the emissions from gasoline vehicles, ignoring the health impacts of producing smog in our communities, ignoring the local and global impacts of climate change that these vehicles, that using gasoline vehicles have. So that's really important that we not evaluate EVs on their own, and that there isn't a replacement for a inherently dirtier technology. Just to wrap up, there's a number of things we can do to make this, to accelerate this transition, to make sure it happens. The first I mentioned is enact policies like the zero emission vehicle regulations. We also need to make sure there is incentives available so that new and used EVs are available and accessible for everyone in the state. We have some programs like that now. They could be greatly improved and more funding for those programs. As Maya mentioned, we need to continue to strengthen gasoline fuel efficiency standards and air pollution standards, because even when we get to 50% sales, that means 50% of the cars are still gasoline vehicles, and they're going to be on the road for 12, 15 years. We need those to be as clean as possible, and they're not right now. We need to make sure that we have utilities and others investing in charging infrastructure and having rate designs so that it is actually easy and cheap for people to plug in. And the last thing I'll note is that we really need to plan ahead. If we know this transition is happening, and I think we should know, it will be happening, we need to plan ahead so that our roads, our buildings and parking lots are ready for EVs over the coming decades. And that doesn't necessarily mean putting a charger at every parking spot right now, but if we build like a new parking garage, we should at least have the space for the wiring, the space for the charger, the space for the electric panel, so we don't have to rip up something that was just built to retrofit it for electrified transportation. So again, it's fairly straightforward, but it's something where there's a lot of resistance to doing this, and it's frustrating because we know that's where things have to go. So I'm sure there's a lot of things about this transition I missed, and I hope there's time for Q&A. I'm not sure there will be, but if not, definitely catch me after this, and I'm happy to discuss more about this. And just like to thank you for your attention, and I think Keishaa is up next.
Hi, everyone. I love that we have some background music going on in here. All right. So I'm Keishaa Austin. I'm the head of partnerships and engagement at Rewiring America. Some of you might be asking, like, what is the head of partnership and engagement doing here talking to us about electrification policy? As you heard a little bit earlier, that's because I have a pretty deep background in it. I just left the CPUC, where I was a senior analyst working on grid planning and reliability. So oftentimes, I'm sure folks have heard the idea that the grid is not ready, there's not enough capacity, how are we going to plan for the load? That was my job. working with PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E to plan for their resources, these DERs and other clean energy technologies to come online. And before I left the CPUC, one of the things, now I'm like, uh-oh, because I don't know if we put enough time in there or we were taking it too slow, so I might be guilty of that as a former regulator. But some of the work that we did that I'm still very proud of, because we are at the commission, they were working very hard to plan for this new load, was the Distributed Energy Resources Action Plan 2.0 that the CPUC just, they voted on it about a month and a half ago, right? And so this policy is basically going to be coordinating the way these DERs are going to be coming online, from market integration to community involvement, as well as market infrastructure, and then actually grid infrastructure as well. So California is ahead of the rest in many aspects, and I'd encourage folks to look at the DER action plan from the CPUC to sort of understand how they are planning to approach policy and regulatory guidance. And that also includes rates and looking at new ways to design a rate structure that takes into account things like vehicle to grid charging. So anyways, that's my background. I was also a consumer advocate for utility ratepayers as well in the District of Columbia, where I now live. And so I'm happy to be back home today to talk about this. Okay, so there's one thing at Rewiring America that we've all come together around, and our three founders really set that idea for us. And that's basically, we need to be electrifying everything. So we've heard already today about electrifying vehicles and transportation, public transportation, but there's like a whole bunch of other stuff that really needs to be electrified, right? And it needs to be electrified today, and we really don't have enough time to be waiting for electrification of some of these other things to become popular. So in thinking about what we need to electrify, I want to think about mapping out energy flows. And that's actually something that our co-founder, Dr. Saul Griffith, did for the U.S. Department of Energy. And when he did that mapping, I think he got it down to 1% fidelity on this Sinky chart. And what we found in that study is that about 42% of energy-related decisions, drive about 42% of emissions. So those decisions that we're making at our kitchen tables as a family, partners, communities, they're driving, right, a lot of the emissions. So there's a lot of opportunities for us as individuals in our households to take action and have a real impact, right? People can actually be involved in this, and it doesn't like take a very heavy lift to get an EV and the charging infrastructure in your home, right? There are very simple things that you can do to be a part of this climate or this clean energy transition. So those decisions, those energy-related decisions that folks are making around their household, around their kitchen table, what we just talked about, right? What kind of cars are we driving? How are we going to heat our homes and water? Heat pump, obviously, right? How are we going to cook our food? We'd like for you to cook it on an induction stove. How are we going to dry our clothes in an electric dryer? And then where does our electricity come from, right? So we want to make sure we have a clean source of energy as well. So that's a lot of power that we're making as individuals here, right? We weld these decisions have a very large impact, and just by us taking some very simple actions, we can have some large success. And so at Rewiring America, we're focused on making the household and communities the center of climate policy. And so my role in partnerships and engagement is to make sure I'm working with local electeds, the Fords and the GMs of the world, IKEAs, anyone that's operating in this space, so that we can make electrification easier and more accessible and cheaper for people to do within their households. And in order to do that, that means we're going to need a whole bunch of new household infrastructure. One thing I found I thought was really cool is that about 42% of the building stock in the US is already electrified, right? So we just need to get the rest of it across the finish line. And what's that gonna take? It's gonna take us electrifying 1 billion machines. Yeah, 1 billion machines, that's a lot. But when you look at it, at the grand scheme of things, you got 98 million space heaters we need to get done, 19 million dryers, 117 million water heaters, 95 million stove ranges, grills, and cooktops. And then, of course, as we've heard about today, we've got over 220 million vehicles that also need to be electrified in order for us to meet our climate goals. What does that look like on the grand scheme of things in terms of households? 500,000 a month, every month for the next 25 years. This is the rate at which we need to be electrifying homes. Sounds like a lot, especially because right now we're probably only electrifying about 500 homes a month. So there's a lot of opportunity, folks, for us to get to that 500,000. And we can do it because as a nation, we've achieved far greater things, and it's at our peril if we don't. And one thing I want to sort of address is because we all love energy efficiency. It's super important. It's done a lot of great things. And it's actually, to me, I think, expanded the conversation to bringing folks to the table who had never really even thought that they cared about energy policy or anything like that. And energy efficiency, I think, has opened a lot of folks' eyes to ways that they can be involved with managing their energy for good. So we don't want people to waste, and we know that energy efficiency or efficiency is good. The challenge, though, is that it hasn't really worked. I love it. I think it's great, but it isn't helping us hit the spot. And we need to move faster because we cannot efficiency our way to zero. It's just not going to happen, right? So we really need to think about transitioning out of this idea of everything being efficient and waste is bad. No, we need electrification, and we need everything on the demand side to be electrified. And we get tons of pushback on that. But that's okay, because that's the solution, right? And together, we can all get this to be the standard climate solution. And I know it's really bold of me to say, like, look, electrification is the climate solution. It is, though. And there's enough research out there to support that argument. And as our founder, Dr. Saul Griffith, has articulated, and there's tons of research and white papers on our website, folks, for you to take a look at to see the research that brings electrification to the forefront as a climate solution. And in my role as a head of partnerships and engagement, it's my job to tie all of this together and bring all sectors together. So as I said, you know, my job is to get the retailers on board, to get the auto manufacturers on board, to get the software makers on board, to get the utilities on board, right? I've got a heavy job to do, but one that I take on with a lot of joy and excitement every single day because I know that this is the answer, and I'm gonna help us get there. But I can't do it without everybody in here, because what we need to do is build an electrification movement. We basically need to mobilize US citizens and folks around the world around this idea that electrification is going to get us to the path that we need to get to, right? And it does not happen without everybody in this room, without folks on this campus, without folks, you know, from where I'm from in South Central Los Angeles. Everybody needs to be a part of this conversation. There is no way that we can do it alone. And so at Rewiring America, that's what I'm focused on. That's what we're all focused on. And we have a research team that puts up papers to sort of address this. We've got an awesome policy team who's been working on the DPA stuff as well, and really trying to get a whole of government approach to electrifying the US. So hopefully I didn't go too fast, but I wanted to leave some time, so I'm sure someone will ask me, is the grid really ready? And I'm going to give you, I'm also an attorney, so I'm going to give you an attorney standard answer, and that's, it depends. But anyways, folks, I wanted to just go very briefly through the need for household electrification. We've talked a lot about EVs and mobility and all of that good stuff, but a lot of this can take place in your home. And we can do it with heat pumps, and yes, it can be difficult because sometimes that comes along with having to get new breaker boxes and other things, and retrofits are not necessarily easy, but there are those small steps that folks can take that really make you feel good about what you're doing, and that's what we want to be focused on at Rewiring America. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions, and thanks.
All right, we're running a little late, but that's okay. You just won't have quite as much time for lunch. But I have one quick question that I think Keishaa kind of alluded to. I want to know your favorite misinformation that you see and how you answer it. I mean, because all of us have, we've been talking about this. There is so much misinformation about EVs, about electrification. Keishaa, you want to start since you, the grid?
Yeah, is this, hello? I would say I'm going to stick with that the grid is, that there is not enough capacity. It is true that there are certain parts on the grid, right, that capacity does not exist for a new load. But that does not mean that it's forever unattainable for us to get new load in those areas. And that's what I did in my work working with the utilities at the CPUC, is to plan for that load, right? And to also look at where on the grid we can site the load to make the best business decisions as well for developers and others, so that they are not being discouraged by this idea that there's no space or there's not enough capacity to put this new load on the grid. So I think that that's a big misconception. And I would also point folks, we have this thing at Rewiring, called circuit breakers, and we put them out about once a month, and all they do is myth bust. So if you have ideas around myth busting, or if you have questions about myth busting, I would encourage you to go to our website where we have it's called Circuit Breaker, and we do a bunch of myth busting there.
Circuitbreaker.
It's at rewiringamerica.org, and it's under our policy section, and it'll have, I think we have about 3 or 4 different kind of myth busters, there.
Cool. Thank you. Maya?
I'm trying to think of which one to say, but I think one of them is that, California is this great climate leader, and that is a narrative that I hear over and over and over again, and maybe that's true, but we also, we need to live up to that, and we're not living up to that. So if we are perceived as a climate leader, we need to be doing more. And I think, and I'd like, sort of more narrative on what more California could be doing. And so we both talked about, for example, what they could be doing better in the cars role. And it's great what they're doing now, but they should be doing better to get us to where we need to be. And we're also one of the leading oil drilling states in the nation. And I think, more attention on that, and the fact that we're really slow at getting rid of oil drilling here is kind of one of the issues. So,
Good point. David?
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite are the ones that now have been killed. When I started doing this work, I would always get well, EVs are just coal powered. I mean, they're ultimately just everything's coming from coal, and I think that has gone by the wayside as coal has started to go. The attacks have gone by the wayside. The other one is that that I mentioned when I talked, is that the idea that nobody wants an EV, that nobody wants. So obviously, right now we see that there's tremendous interest from everyday people that want an EV. And especially in California, the one that I'm hearing more about now is what was mentioned by Keishaa, is how is this going to work with the electric grid? I am optimistic that EVs will be an asset for the grid, not kill the grid. It will take some work in integrating these vehicles, but if everyone has a big battery in their garage, that means we can actually use that stored energy to actually help the grid. It's also wrong. I've also seen that compared in articles to like, well, this is like adding 2 air conditioners to every house or something like that, which is completely wrong, because you want to turn the air conditioner on when it's warm, and everyone else wants to do it at the same time. A lot of times your electric vehicle only needs to charge for an hour or 2 overnight, and you don't really care if that happens at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. So it's not like a refrigerator. It's not like an air conditioner. We have a lot of control. We could have a lot of control over when these things are charged and when that demand happens, and actually sync it up with the availability of renewable energy and have these vehicles be an asset, not a detriment.
I think that's a really good point. I know David and Maya and I both have, we all have EVs at home, and you learn how much myth there is once you're driving one, because yeah, you either charge at 2 in the morning and you set it through an app, or if you have solar panels, you charge while the solar panels. So and the chart, I think Electrify America is up to 100% renewables, or almost there, when you charge at those charging stations. So, there's just a lot out there. I think the cobalt thing, that's a myth that's kind of crazy, that these batteries do use cobalt, but a whole lot less than they did even 5 years ago. Washington Post just had a story in May, and they linked to a 2016 Amnesty International thing about cobalt and these mines, and it was like, really, Washington Post, can't you do a little better than that? Because it was outdated information. So as a journalist, we really need to do a little better job at sorting out the myths from the misinformation out there and the facts. So any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so we are.
Here, let me repeat that real quick. Okay. She asked if Keisha's been communicating with apartment building managers about solar. I'm sorry, about chargers.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in my work at Rewiring, some of what we want to be doing is reaching out to management companies, owners, developers, new building construction. Retrofits are a bit harder, right? So we want to make sure that we're getting to folks before they get it up, but we are having those conversations. And then when I was a consumer advocate, we would work very closely with, in the district, it was the apartment association, where we would try to work to get chargers into these households. It is challenging. And oftentimes, management or owners want some sort of incentive as well, right? Because they've got to cover that cost. But it is a part of our outreach and something that we continue to prioritize, as we understand by getting those folks on board, right? We do a lot there. And it's just not chargers. It's also heat pumps. It's also induction stoves. It's a whole approach to the household.
Have is where to charge their vehicles, and so that's a barrier to them purchasing them. And then on the flip side, apartment renters are often future homeowners, and once they get comfortable and used to having that convenience, it's going to spur builders to include it as standard equipment in homes too.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is one of the reasons why we continue to reach out to both of those those constituents because we know that we want folks to be building electric, right, and allowing for folks to come into a household that has all of these tools already there. And in certain places you're seeing that, but household developers have not fully committed to that, and that's what we hope to be able to do, is bring those folks across the table to say we're going to be building all electric from now on. But part of the challenge too is consumer preference, and so we also have to work around consumers loving their gas stoves or loving their their gas cars, and that is a challenge that I think all of us have to work through collectively to bring folks on board.
I believe the state of California does have incentives too. I know, I sent some to a small inn in the desert that asked me about chargers, and I was like, yeah, there's some money out there. So
California has tons of incentives, and so does the CPUC. One of the challenges is that a lot of folks don't know about it, right? Or the folks that know about it have already been in the market, so the incentives are going to the same people. What we need to do is get more folks aware, and then more folks tapping into those incentives as well.
Another question?
Yes. So
Sorry.
thank you very
Yes.
much.
Brian?
For the people here and the millions of people watching online, thank you very much. I've dedicated my life towards combating misinformation and disinformation. I urge you to contact our editors at openmindmag.org, which is the first publication focused 100% on tackling the controversies and issues with incredible journalism. So openmindmag.org, the editors from Omni and a whole host of other great publication journalism are there to write those stories, so thank you. But I am intrigued by the idea that there are big ideas. And I'm really curious. I don't know the answers to this, so I pose this to you. When I was in China, they have a perfect $5,000 electric vehicle that appears to be quite used by the populace. And just recently, of course, just getting to LA yesterday, seeing the pump price of $8.95 in Beverly Hills for a gallon of gas, does that also spur on the electrification? Does that create human behavior automatically as big ideas? So yes, you're functioning within the context of the grid issues, et cetera, and public policy, but the things that drive things are the populace's behaviors. And if they could see a $5,000 electric car and it actually works and it's safe, and the price of gas scaring them. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And Brian, thank you he is actually our benefactor for our, he started the Science Literacy Foundation that he mentioned, and Open Mind magazine's amazing. So,
Yay.
Thank you, Brian. Yes.
Yeah, certainly appreciate all the discussion on charging earlier. One thing I'm curious about is that when I look at the EV market today and the car market in general, you see this trend towards luxury vehicles and higher priced vehicles. Part of that is due to supply issues, but also part of it's just due to the direction that the auto manufacturers are going. When do you think when are we going to see kind of a reduction or more of a going towards more affordable cars, lower price points for cars, particularly for the EV segment?
I think David can address that really well.
Yeah. So what we are seeing some short-term effects still of the supply chain issues. Is that constraints on chips, constraints on other materials to make vehicles in general, gasoline and EV. And so what's happened in California, if you look at the data, is that the lower end vehicles where there's a lower price margin, so your Honda Civic, your Toyota Corolla, those sales of those vehicles are way down because the supply is way down. Mm-hmm. So it's actually made the top two sellers in California now are the Tesla Model 3 and Tesla Model Y, and Tesla in the first quarter of 2022 is the number 2 selling automaker brand in Calofornia. And it's because the EVs have come up, but it's also because these issues with the gasoline cars, especially on the lower end. And so if you have a limited number of chips, you're going to put it in your highest margin vehicles. So that's going to be your luxury vehicles. It's going to be your higher end non-luxury vehicles, the bigger SUVs and trucks. So that's what's happening right now. I think what is important long term for having more affordable EVs, and also just sort of EVs that work for more people is having these higher requirements. Because if you need to sell 75% of your vehicles electric, you can't just do that with luxury vehicles. You can't just do that with the high end of the market. You have to have minivans, you have to have small cars, big cars, and so that's going to push things to the rest of the market. I guess the last thing I'd say is that what we've seen in the auto industry before, like over decades, is that like things like airbags, things like those large screen, entertainment screens, those always go into the more expensive vehicles first. We're seeing that in the EV space as well, as this is being a premium drivetrain. But also we're seeing it just bundled with a lot of other features. It's really hard to get an EV that doesn't also have all the self-driving features, that doesn't have a 20-inch screen in the middle of the car. And that's the other thing about, like, as we go further, as we get more EVs out there, is decoupling this drivetrain, having the efficient drivetrain, but not having every bell and whistle that isn't related to the EV nature of the car also on the car.
I'm going to jump in here too, because China and India have auto manufacturer EVs that are very low priced. They're not really in our markets yet, but I would think the automakers should pay attention, because they're managing to do, these small delivery vans that are EVs, and there's a lot of innovation in China with three-wheel, with one wheel in the back, which is more efficient. We were talking about this last night here, and so there's a lot out there. Norway, it's 75%, I believe, of new car sales are EVs, and that's because the government is putting the money there for people to, to not only buy EVs, but to charge them easily. So a lot of it, again, comes down to government, which Maya is the person who's suing, or one of the people who's suing the government over some of these things. So any other questions out here? Yes.
Hi, thanks. My name is Miranda Green. I'm a reporter with Floodlight. A lot of the reporting I do is about investigative reporting and accountability journalism. And we touched broadly earlier about the misinformation campaigns that, are prevalent about electric, and especially with this kind of push towards electrification of homes, especially in California. We've been seeing a lot of a big push of new electricity, no gas stoves in homes, no gas hookups. But with that has been a lot of pushback from different groups. I was hoping you could talk to me a bit about those misinformation campaigns you're seeing, you're up against, and kind of the efforts that you're putting in to counteract that, idea that this idea of a love for a gas stove just comes from, a person, not from, a mindset that was, put into place by decades by the gas industry and other things like that.
Yeah, that's, as it relates to the household electrification, as I said, we, on a regular basis, are now trying to create, we've only been around since July 2020, and I actually just started 4 months ago. So we're really new, but what we're trying to do, again, through some of our content is, these myth busters, but then also one of the markets that we'll be most, heavily focused on, and of course there's lots of activity and folks focused on it here, is California, exactly for those reasons. We hear folks say there's nothing wrong with a gas stove. It's if it's, installed incorrectly, then that's when it becomes dangerous, right? And that's just, that's not the case. And what we want to do is make that the challenges or the difficulties of having those kind of things in your home really accessible to the community, to the household, right? It's so much, it drives home the need for a movement. And I even think that it speaks to the need to build the movement for electrification growth of vehicles, right? Like, if people are demanding lower cost vehicles that are cleaner, then the market has to respond. That's what we have to do, is we have to sort of create the market for it. And unfortunately, a lot of folks don't know why we're saying you need to move to an all electric sort of, future. And so our job is to explain why you need to move there, and we need to get I don't want to call out any names, right, because we want them to come on board to us as members of our coalition and commit to electrification. But we're working with those gas utilities and others to try to bring them on board. And of course, it's not an easy discussion to have, but we also are going to the people. And I think that that's where the power is. And it's not an easy approach, but it's the best one.
What was there was a study just about 2 months ago, I think, about gas appliances in homes and asthma.
Yeah,
the health connections.
Yeah, and I have asthma, and I grew up with a gas stove in my household. And when that study came out, and I think some of the folks that push back on that particular study, that they'll say, well, that's because it wasn't connected correctly, and if it's not correct, well, what does it matter? Like, if I don't know if my gas stove is connected, or not, I'm still having an asthma attack, and I still got to go to the hospital to treat it. So it doesn't matter if it's not installed correctly. It's the simple risk of it being in my household. Not even if it's installed correctly, I don't want to deal with it. And what I'm trying to do in working with our comms team is create the messaging behind that to connect to the individual. And I'll speak as a minority and an African American community where incidents of asthma are very high. It is super important to me to talk to folks in my community about getting those gas stoves out of their house, and then compare your medical bills to the savings that you get from removing that gas stove out of your house, because it is such a danger, but folks don't know that. So that's our job.
Great, thanks. Maya, did you have anything to add to that? Where is this coming from, the misinformation?
Oh, where's misinformation coming from? Oh, I mean, I think, yeah, so for example, in California, there have been a lot of efforts in cities to require that new buildings are all electric, and we've seen a lot of pushback from gas utilities, for example, but also gas utilities that are creating sort of kind of grass tops fake coalitions where they say that they're environmental justice coalitions, and they're arguing that people can't afford it, and so therefore you can't require this and things like that. But it's actually the gas company that's organizing this. So that's kind of one other.
There's AstroTurf.
AstroTurf. That's what I was looking for. Not grass top. AstroTurf. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those pop up a lot. So.
And they're like in Colorado. They're everywhere pretending to be something that they are not. But that's our job, right?
Exactly.
And that's our job as journalists too, to figure out which ones just look green, and which ones are funded. Where's the funding coming from? So, yeah. And did we answer the question? Is that good? Any other questions? Well,
are we all ready for lunch?
Yeah, exactly. We all want lunch, so we'll all be here for lunch, I think. So if you have other questions and you're shy, then come talk with us.